propaganda and how they both relate to games. So first I'm going to kick off with what is politics, and then I'm going to segue into what is propaganda, and then I'm going to wrap up with what is games. But before that, yes, I am Tom, I am Dr. Tom. I did a PhD here at the university on socio-rhetorical online argument, which was mostly reading a whole bunch of Twitter arguments, and that is exactly as depressing as it sounds. Since then, I've bounced around a number of research projects, including some crowdsourcing ones and some involved in sort of like data and engagement, and I'll probably touch on those in a little bit. And yeah, now, as I'm sure most of you know, I teach on the game design module here, as well as a number of other courses. So, first off, the politics of games. You have probably seen people say this before: keep politics out of my games. I don't want to hear about any of your politics in my first-person shooters and things like that. Well, tough. All games have politics in them, kind of by their very nature. All media has politics in it, whether it's a case of what we show in it, or what we choose not to show, or even what we don't think that we are not showing because we haven't thought about it. Kind of literally everything that you consume and everything that you do will be in some way political, and that goes doubly so for games. And we wouldn't want it to be any other way. If we strip out all of the political meaning behind everything in our games, what we're left with is just a set of really, really boring games. So, what is politics? Well, as everyone knows, politics comes from the Latin for poly, meaning many, and tix, meaning bloodsucker. No. It comes from the Greek, politica, which means the affairs of the cities, and it is all about how groups of people organize and decide on things. But ultimately it's a lot more than that, because it affects everything about our day-to-day lives, it affects the things we believe, it affects how we self-organize, how we are organized by others, and how we treat and interact with other people. And this is sort of why. The media that we consume or create shapes our culture, the sets of ideas and thoughts that we have as sort of groups of people or groups of individuals. The culture that we are a part of shapes the society, the broader group of people that we interact with, the gatherings that we have, and that society shapes the way that that society is then governed. But equally, the way that society is governed affects the way that society behaves, which then affects those individual cultures, which affects what media is created and how it is consumed and how it is processed. And all of this ends up shaping and affecting all of us personally as individuals. So, yeah, everything is politics and everything is important. So how does this translate into games? Well, all games are abstractions of reality, unless we give Tarn Adams another 20 years and he makes Dwarf Fortress basically an actual universe simulator, but we're not quite there yet. All games are based on some sort of abstraction. They're never one-to-one with reality. We have to make some assumptions because we couldn't program the entire fabric of reality into a game, because then it would have to include itself, and then so on and so on and so on. So we have to make decisions as game designers, what we include and what we don't include, and the things that we do include, we have to think about how are we including them. And as such, we have to boil down incredibly complex and nuanced topics to effectively some numbers. And one of the key ways that we sort of see this happen is in what we set the goals of our game to be. So if you think of a modern strategy game, so for example Civilization 6, like the goal of 90%, maybe more strategy games, is get more technology, get more resources, win game. And that's not to say that that is inherently wrong or bad, but it is an assumption that we have made, or the designers have made, that that is how we should be progressing and how we should be winning. And partly I would agree. More technology is often good; it develops things further. Consuming more and more and more and more and more, arguably not so. But you rarely see games that sort of work the other way around. So here, for example, is So I did have an example for this, but I may have dreamt it. So instead I'm using Terra Nil. Terra Nil is a game about, you sort of start with a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and you effectively have to build technology to reseed the world and sort of create this wonderful biodiversity And then at the end of the game, you have to reclaim and destroy all of that technology you've created so that the planet can flourish even more. And I've yet to see, I'm sure there is an example out there that will prove me wrong, but I have yet to see a game where you start off with, a massive sprawling city or a massive sprawling civilization, where you are at the limits of, you've consumed all of the resources of that planet, and you are having to downsize to save the world or something like that. I have yet to see a game that tries to do something like that. Have any of you seen a game like that? There is bound to be one somewhere, even if it's a tiny indie project, but I've not found it yet. So this is something about sort of our assumptions of, what is desirable, what should we be doing to try and win the game or, reality effectively. Similarly, another incredibly complex and nuanced subject is relationships. But most games involving a relationship, there isn't really a relationship at all. It's just a case of you go through a bunch of steps, whether it's shooting zombies or jumping on turtles, and at the end there is a princess, and congratulations, you live happily ever after, and everything's perfect and wonderful, right? But even the games that include some element of relationships, it's often a case of just, you give the person the thing they like, and you do that twice a week, and then they will love you forever. And then you put them in your house, and occasionally they'll give you a coffee. And that's the entire sum of that relationship. So, I'm going a little bit hard on Stardew Valley. I do love Stardew Valley, and it's not primarily a game about relationships. It's a game about, farming and things like that. Although, my first point also applies to Stardew Valley as well, because, you escape the rat race, your horrible office job, and become an industrialized capitalist creating hundreds of thousands of cauliflowers every year. But yeah, so this sort of still ties into the first point. We're deciding what our game is about, so we're deciding, what is the content that we're going to focus on, what is the content that we're going to sort of abstract mostly away. And again, that's not inherently a bad thing, but it's a decision that we are making, and that decision sort of implies, or I guess reveals, some of our thoughts about the current status quo, what we think is desirable, and so on. And I'm definitely not the first person to have sort of made this point about relationships in games. But of course, there are alternatives. There are games that put more of a focus on that, and therefore decide to make the simulation of it a bit more complex. So this is actually a board game called Fog of Love. So rather than this being a single-player game about wooing the person of your dreams, this is a collaborative storytelling game where you are playing two halves of a couple. And despite the slightly heteronormative colours of the different pieces, it's actually a surprisingly diverse and inclusive game. I recommend having a look for it if you see it. But there are lots of sort of decisions and consequences in this. There's a lot more sort of detailed modelling of that relationship going on, even though under the hood it's still a whole bunch of numbers. So I'm going to take a second to actually basically rip off an extra credits video and talk about some other ways that we could think about modelling relationships in games. So for example, rather than giving somebody a gift and that giving them 50 love points, and then we just keep doing that twice a week until they are at 1,000 love points and they love us forever, we can sort of think about that in a more nuanced way. We're still only manipulating numbers in the back end, but the idea that you can reduce an entire person to just, well, if you give them a gift they like you more, is reductive. So how do you develop that further? Well, for a start, if you are a total stranger and you give me an incredibly romantic gift, I'm not going to give you 50 love points. That's just creepy, right? So we can bake in more interesting parts of that simulation. So you can have thresholds for how well you know this person already, and that can sort of affect the reactions and interreactions in relationships. You can have things like, for example, if I give you a boiled egg every day, eventually you're going to get sick of boiled eggs, right? There has to be variety to these things. You can have, for a start, different gifts, but also different sort of preferences based on different seasons or times of day and things like that. And again, this is sounding very mechanical, but at the end of the day, games are fundamentally a bucket of mechanics that we sort of see this emergent storytelling come out of a lot of the time, or at least simulating a story. So, now everyone's favourite part of a court, audience participation. So are there any other genres that you can think of about, well, first off, what other genres can you think of? So we've got sort of two very rough ones there. Somebody pick a genre.
First-person shooter.
First-person shooter, brilliant. So what are the goals of a first-person shooter? How do we represent that through numbers? All right, I'm not picking just directly on you. There we go.
Kill as many people as you can.
Yeah, pretty much to kill as many people as you can. And so there are some other thoughts there as well.
Oh yeah, just to halt to secure an area, defend an area, something like that.
Yeah. Anyone else want to throw out? Yeah. Don't die? Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is not to say that these things are all inherently bad. In fact, they're often like a big part of what makes games challenging and fun, right? They're frequently about sort of testing the player's reactions, and the actual actions that you're taking within the game are more a vehicle for sort of that challenge and experience and things like that. But there are still different ways of viewing and interpreting that. So if we take a look at two sort of, it would be charitable to call them police simulation games, but Battlefield Hardline, again, is that sort of very much a case of, yeah, you're a man with a gun and you're going to shoot the baddies and it's fine, and it's all about sort of that, fluid motion and sort of reactions and skill ceiling and challenge kind of a thing. But there are definitely games that, again, try to work more nuance into that same sort of scenario. And again, I'm not saying every game has to be perfectly nuanced about every possible scenario because, again, at some point that's infeasible. We have limited time and resources. But the areas that we focus on can change the tone and the politics of our games quite a lot. So SWAT 4, I don't know if any of you have seen this before, but this is a game where you are, because you're the police, you can't just kick in the door and shoot everyone. That's how that works, right? So you kick in the door, and then you have to press a button to yell, put your hands up, this is the police. And if you don't do that, you get fired. I've seen people criticize SWAT 4 as being unrealistic because there are consequences for your actions. But the point is, it's showcasing and highlighting sort of different parts of society and revealing different parts of our politics, which I'm skating closely here. But so first-person shooters is like the obvious example of a genre that definitely has some clearly defined ideas and politics based on who those enemies are that you're shooting, how you sort of tackle them, what's the motivations for your character, and so on and so on and so on. Management games, another one. Oftentimes, very similar to strategy games, the goal is make the line go up, and that's fine. Like humans like watching the line go up, but again, that's because we are a product of the society that we live in. And it's very rare that you end up with a game about making the line go down, but making happiness go up, or something like that. But at the end of the day, that is just another kind of line. Cool, so let's take a brief tangent to talk about, rather than the politics of games, politics about games or around games. I'm sure I had another slide in there somewhere. So first off, moral panics. So I'm sure you've seen all of the tropes about these damn video games turning our kids into murderous psychopaths. That's been pretty conclusively disproven now, right? There are plenty of studies saying no, video games aren't turning children into psychopathic killers. But despite that all being clearly and demonstrably untrue, it's had far-reaching consequences for the industry. A lot of legislation was brought in. Lots of things like, for example, age ratings and things being federally enforced after, anyone remember the hot coffee controversy? Similarly, does the phrase attributes about ethics in game journalism mean anything to anyone? I was wondering, so I was talking about this the other day and I realized this was about a decade ago now, which makes me feel very old. If you're not aware of it, there was a brief controversy, I say brief, it's still having repercussions and ramifications now, where some people were, let's say, had certain feelings about some women working in the games industry and sort of used this as their tagline to mount a harassment campaign to force them out. And yeah, as I say, the repercussions of that are still something that's ongoing. There are all sorts of political viewpoints that not only impact games, but the games industry, people playing them, people designing them. From pressure groups and lobbyists to harassment, and this can sort of be codified into regulations and lawsuits and so on and so on. So one thing I was going to say was, generally, these damn video games turning our kids into murderous psychopaths, yeah, totally disproven. There are some games out there that have not really helped this cause, but this one is a pretty egregious trying to link that. So this was the day after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and a Sky News said, well, they might have used Microsoft Flight Simulator to train, which was patently absurd, but again, trying to whip up this moral panic and this frenzy because, hey, moral panics and frenzies sell newspapers. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about power imbalances within the games industry as a whole. I did try to limit this so that it didn't become Tom rants about capitalism for 40 minutes. But yeah, there are a whole bunch of let's call them economic concerns within the games industry. Everything from different distribution platforms. So you've probably seen the ongoing war between Steam and Epic. Some of this comes down to how much each of them are paying their developers, or what cut they're giving to content creators and so on. But equally between sort of developers, publishers, and consumers themselves, and everything surrounding the idea of crunch culture, which is a very worrying part of the industry. And I have said this a few times in the games development module. Like, I really love games, I really love making games. I'm always wary about telling people that they should go into the games industry. There are plenty of good games companies out there, don't worry. But it's always something to just check when you're applying to places, like finding out what the company culture is at places. I can see a few worried looks out there. I'm not trying to scare you off, but yeah, go into it with some amount of caution. Roblox took this sort of one step further and got its content consumers to become content creators, exploiting very, very young developers and taking enormous portions of the revenue that they were getting for their work, and effectively paying them in company script rather than actual cash money. Crunch culture, obviously, a wide issue within the industry. It's very easy to sort of say, well, of course you can work late tonight. You're so passionate about games, right? You love games, and yeah, of course we love games. We all love games, but it's really important that we are able to, get paid for our work, and at the end of the day, go home and enjoy playing some games rather than just being fed into a wood chipper. There's also the idea of soft power in games. So everything from geopolitics, how the global market works. You'll have seen in, I really don't want to bring up Brexit, but in the Brexit negotiations and things like that, one of the things that constantly came up was, what about the digital industry in the UK? It's one of our fastest growing industries. It makes up a massive portion of our GDP and so on. How does that impact the greater economic market and so on? There's also lots of because there's so much money in the games industry, there's a certain amount of political pressure that goes with it. And yeah, as I mentioned as well, laws and regulations to try and follow some of these things. So for example, the EU has recently been looking at actually tackling things like loot boxes, and again, I'll touch on this a little bit later. A famous Hearthstone esports player was banned from voicing some political sentiments on stream, and Blizzard was basically went offline recently in China because they couldn't come to an agreement with one of their major sort of networks. As far as I'm aware, these two stories are completely unrelated. But it just goes to show the amount of power and control that people can exert, not only on the industry as a whole, but individual developers and individual players of games. Whew. So I'm going to take a stop for a little drink. So, propaganda. What on earth is propaganda? Well, another definition, this one less funny. Propaganda is basically a set of concerted messages aimed at influencing people. It's trying to change people's minds. And again, much in the same way that everything is politics, a large chunk of things are propaganda depending on exactly how you look at them. There are a whole bunch of different sort of kinds of propaganda, from overt, where something is, like an advertising campaign is a pretty overt set of propaganda. It's very obvious that somebody has paid a bunch of money to influence you. And I was going to say it's fine. It's not necessarily fine, but it's just a thing that happens. But there's also covert propaganda, where people are doing things that are deliberately manipulative without being open about how they're trying to convince you or why they're trying to convince you. And there's also the idea of subconscious propaganda. So again, going back to sort of how our own sort of politics reveal or influence what we put in games, we can we do sort of the same thing sometimes without thinking about it. We will put stuff in our games because we just assume that that is the way that things work, that is the way the world works, and therefore that's what goes into our games. And it's not always a thing that we think about. There's also a different sort of way of breaking up different types of propaganda. You have white propaganda, where the source of it is well known. You have grey propaganda, where the source of it is unclear. And there's also the idea of black propaganda, so similar to basically a black op or a false flag, where propaganda is published under a particular name or authority or organization when it actually came from a totally different source in order to discredit that person, authority, or organization. So why do people use propaganda? Why is it included in games? Why does it show up? How does it show up? Well, there are a whole bunch of different reasons. I'm going to list a couple of them here and then go through some examples. Obviously, to rally people to your cause. Effectively, to get people that already agree with you to agree with you even more thoroughly, let's say. But also to persuade people who maybe don't agree with you yet. And again, depending on what you think about the topic that they're trying to persuade, that might well be persuade or manipulate. And likewise, you might be trying to educate people or inform them. But again, depending on your point of view on that subject, it might be misinformation, although there are quite a few clear-cut cases of one versus the other. Incidentally, has anyone played Republic of Times? So it's one of Lucas Pope's first games, the dev that made Papers, Please and a bunch of other games. It's free, it's online, it takes like 3 minutes to play. I'd give it a look, it's quite good. So, how do we spot all of these various and insidious forms of propaganda? Well, kind of by their very nature, the sort of covert and black ops propaganda are deliberately designed to be difficult to spot. But in terms of overt propaganda, there's often an agenda at play. It's usually quite easy to spot, provided it's something that you disagree with, or at least something you don't take for granted. Because as you're playing this game, you will start to question things and sort of say, well, why am I being asked to do this? That's not how this thing should work. But if it's something that you already agree with, odds are it will just slide right past you and you will take it as written, which is kind of a worrying thought. So one example of this is, anyone familiar with these two games? A couple of nods, a couple of shakes. So the game on the left is America's Army. This is a game that was developed by the US military and not hidden, like they funded it, they distributed it for free. It was absolutely designed as a recruitment tool. It is a first-person shooter. It also includes things like an explanation of basic medical skills and how to triage people and things like that. The game on the right is a game created by Hezbollah, which is very, very similar, but obviously you will get very, very different reactions from people if you show them these two games. So often, propaganda is one of these tricky things where if it's something that you sort of have already internalized and agree with, you think that it is fine, and if it is something contrary to what you already believe, then suddenly it's not only obvious, but also dangerous, and so on. So, how does all of this actually relate to games, and what makes them so important in this field? Well, games are made to be played. They're not something that we necessarily consume passively. It's not like a billboard that we see on the side of the road. And this applies not just to digital games, but to board games, and even the games that you played in the playground when you were little, or possibly still do, I don't know. But things like games like Cops vs. Robbers, for example, it has a clear notion of who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. And that's fine, but again, there are lots of assumptions that games make based on the rules that they use to sort of describe the world in which they are set, that we don't always think about, that we don't always question. And because we're active participants in a game as opposed to other parts of media, it's very easy to be drawn into those rules. So, going on to the language of ludic propaganda, which was basically a phrase I wrote down and decided I liked quite a lot, so I ended up turning it into this entire talk. Ludic just means to play, but it's a slightly pretentious way of saying it. So the language of ludic propaganda, basically why are games so powerful? And the reason that they are so powerful for this is the same reason they are powerful for everything else, because they are interactive. They give us a chance to immerse ourselves in it and be part of the action, be part of the story. And by doing so, they make us complicit and culpable in what we are doing. Quick show of hands, who's played Spec Ops: The Line? Who has seen the video on Spec Ops: The Line that was part of the Gamedev module? Not as many hands as I was expecting. Basically, Spec Ops sort of takes that trope and runs with it. It makes you do things that it knows are wrong and you know are wrong, and then you do them, and then it berates you for doing those things. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend having a look at Dave Millard's talk on a critical reading of Spec Ops: The Line. It goes into that in a lot more detail, and it is very, very good. But yeah, games make you make choices. They make you participate. And again, going back to what we said about how those rules are set up and how those choices are set up, they can make you think that there are a limited set of choices available to you, even when there is actually more. If the game convinces you that this is the good choice, the mechanically viable choice, the optimal choice, that can begin to shape your perceptions of the world and your perceptions of society, politics, and everything else, because everything is politics. So, going back to those examples of propaganda, games to rally. There are a whole bunch of games out there that are, basically just hating on particular demographics. I am absolutely not going to name drop any of those here because they do not deserve it. They do not deserve any traffic at all. They are garbage. They are mostly there for shock value. They're certainly not trying to, convince any of us. They are there basically to outrage people and to make the devs' friends laugh. But they're also an important component in what is called stochastic terrorism. Is anyone familiar with that? So stochastic terrorism is the idea that if you, for example, demonize a particular group loud enough and for long enough, eventually some lone wolf will commit some sort of terrorist act against that group. And you, as the person that has been advocating for this, can say, gosh, I wasn't expecting this at all. How dare this lone wolf go off and do this thing? And there comes a point where it is basically a statistical probability that this is going to happen more and more and more because of the media that has been put out about this. And games are exactly as culpable to this as they are to other things. So they may not turn people into murderers, but they may nudge people who were on the cusp of becoming a murderer towards particular targets. But that is kind of grim for this talk, so I'm going to swiftly move on to games I actually like. So, equally in the same way that, there are, I don't want to say there are dangers to games being an interactive medium, but as there are sort of things that can draw us into that, that doesn't always make it a bad thing. There are games that allow us to explore different concepts and ideas to the ones that we are comfortable with, because they can provide us with a different point of view. The idea of, the magic circle. Here is the magic circle on the ground, and we are going to step inside that, and we are going to suspend our disbelief. We are going to take part in this world that exists, and it's no longer our world, it's this world. And that means that we can explore ideas that we wouldn't be able to explore elsewhere, explore different points of view, explore things about ourselves. And that is a really, really powerful thing to think about. Obviously, games are very, very capable of persuading, just like any other story, but again, because games are an interactive medium, they can do a lot more to tug at our heartstrings than necessarily films, books, or music, or anything else. Because we often have, not always, but often have an avatar in a game world that represents us, or that we want to take care of and protect and so on, the consequences of our actions that impact our avatar sort of swing back around to impacting us, and this can be like a really powerful rhetorical tactic. Rhetoric, by the way, is sort of the art of persuasion. It is not, you're not having to logically convince somebody, you can just convince them. Games also give us a chance to explore a lot more in the way of, as I say, these choices. We get to decide from things that are maybe not so clear-cut, maybe not so black and white, a lot of the reason moral choice systems in games are sometimes disappointing is because they are somewhat reductive. And again, that goes way back to the beginning of this talk about what choices that we can feasibly put in our games. If we're not making a game that's predominantly about these choices, it doesn't make sense to have a massive, elaborate, branching network of different choices. Although, again, if you've been on the games course, we've talked about how to manage that kind of agency in the past and at least simplify and abstract parts of it so that you can give the appearance of a number of different choices in a way that doesn't affect the overall story. So this screenshot is from the McDonald's video game. It may surprise you to learn that this was not put out by McDonald's. This was put out by an Italian company called Morello, I forget. But this is a game where the systems are set up so that so you are playing a fast food chain. I don't know why I'm being coy about it. It's literally called the McDonald's video game. You're playing as McDonald's, and you have to maintain a number of parts of the supply chain, from raising cows in South America to like butchering and slaughtering them to turning them into tasty burgers. But the mechanics of that incentivize certain actions. So you start off with this small plot of land where you can raise your cattle, but it's never enough. Line must go up. So you have to expand into the empty fields nearby, and that's fine. But then you run out of fields, and line must still go up. So you start bulldozing bits of forest. And line must still go up. So you start bulldozing people's villages and so on. And line must keep going up. So you end up being incentivized to expand and expand in this way up until the point where you are doing things that you may not be entirely comfortable with, and therefore you get to explore the idea of why certain systemic problems arise, even though everyone participating in the system might even be nominally good people. Systems can coalesce around us that encourage us to do certain things. This is another game that sort of, again, mechanically incentivizes certain actions. It is Defcon. If you've either seen this or the film War Games, you know that the only winning move is not to play. This is a game where score is measured in millions of civilians killed. And it's also incredibly effective. So a group of researchers from Concordia asked a set of people a bunch of questions about nuclear war, everything from how likely they thought it was, to how likely they thought it would be that they would survive, to the dangers surrounding nuclear weapons. They took those people, split them in half, or split them into two groups, not split them in half, but they gave half of them, a set, I can't remember what they gave the first half. They gave them a set of research papers to read, that was it, about nuclear weapons. The other half had to play Defcon for about 10 minutes. They then brought them back, asked them the same set of questions again, and suddenly the people that had played Defcon were a lot more pessimistic about their chances. Games are really, really powerful in changing people's minds. So, segueing slightly into misinformation, you can tell I was flagging slightly by the time I wrote this because there are fewer bullet points. Games can also sort of warp some of our interpretations of history. So has anybody played the latest Modern Warfare, but they've released another one, so that doesn't hold up. But if anyone's played this game? No? So, okay, brilliant. So you don't know where I'm going with this. So in this game, there is a level where you are basically a sniper on Overlook, and a support character sort of mentions offhand that, yeah, that sort of tangled wreck of vehicles down there is from the Russian invasion in 1991, and now we call it the Highway of Death. Except that that's a thing that actually happened, and it was a thing that the Americans did. So it's kind of weird that they decided to rename it. Like, obviously, in this context, there's a rogue Russian general, he's the main villain of the game, sure, fine. But it's weird to change, name drop an actual thing that happened and attribute it to somebody else. Because at the very least, that was controversial. But the thing is, going back to that for a second, how many of you had heard of that event before I just mentioned it? Okay, so a couple of you. But a whole bunch of you hadn't. And if you played that game, you would just assume that that was the way it had happened, right? So that's weird. But yeah, games, again, like any other media, can sort of colour our perception of the past and how things happen, particularly if they're made out to be sort of even semi-realistic. Games can also be very actively used to misinform, often, and increasingly more often. Gameplay footage is passed off as real-world footage in news broadcasts. And this has happened so much so with this particular game that the developers have had to release a statement telling journalists what to look out for when people try and publish this or pass it off as real-world footage. Whew. What time is it? How long have I got? So I'm going to go on a brief little tangent about gamification. So gamification, rather than just making a game for game's sake, is adding game-like elements to something that isn't really a game. It's often used in education and in science. It's widely used for training machine learning systems because it's a good way of getting people to do something incredibly boring. And we call those games with a purpose. So gamification by itself isn't inherently a bad thing. In fact, it has involved lots of really cool and interesting projects. Here are two of them. Galaxy Zoo was a way of helping NASA basically annotate loads of footage from, I think, the Hubble telescope and a number of others. Foldit was similarly a similar project but based in biology about the structure of proteins. At the time that this came out, machine learning wasn't particularly good at sort of understanding 3D structures of things like that. But people are kind of hardwired to spot those kinds of patterns, so these scientists basically leveraged that, turned it into a game, and got people to understand the structure of proteins that had previously eluded scientists. And in fact, in the first, I think, 13 days of a particular problem being released, it was solved by people playing video games after it had eluded scientists for a decade. So gamification can do a lot of really, really good things. Obviously, it can be used for nefarious means as well. Loot boxes are a prime example of this, giving you that sort of like addictive, inducing rush of, ooh, maybe I'll get a reward, maybe I won't, and then immediately funneling that into getting you to pony up lots of money for effectively a box of nothing, which is genius, if horrible. And there are also lots of techniques involved in crowdsourcing, so much in the same way that there are lots of examples of using gamification because it's a really engaging thing to do for science and education. There is lots of research into, well, it turns out if we just make this a game, we can pay people less, which isn't a great outlook on life. And similarly, if you get a whole bunch of people to compete at doing a thing and then just pay the one that did it the best, you can get away with getting hundreds of people to do a bit of work for you and only paying one of them because it's a game. So that kind of sums up why what we make matters, but I'm going to hammer that home a little bit more. All of these things affect not only the way that we play games, but also the ways that we create them. I'm certainly not saying that you shouldn't set out to make a game that will change somebody's mind because you're worried that it's propaganda or something like that. If anything, I'm saying you absolutely should go out there and make games to try and change people's minds and hopefully change them for the better. But it should certainly be something that you put thought into, whether you're setting out to change somebody's mind or not. I hope after this talk that when you go away and you make a game and you're making these abstractions of reality, that you sort of consider why you're doing certain things, how you're changing certain things, how those mechanics then coalesce together to form those goals, and what that might be saying about the world that we live in. Obviously, it is really, really important to include like a diverse set of voices within the games that we create. It is really, really easy to fill your game with people who look like you because that is your primary experience of the world. You are you, and therefore you can go into your game, and that's fine. But it is worth stopping and taking a look and speaking to other people about their experience of the world, incorporating those different viewpoints into things, because A, it will give you a more interesting spin on a particular topic that you thought you knew all about, and B, it's really important for other people to see themselves in your game as well. If you were at the Global Game Jam this year, you will have seen the keynote from Mary Kenny, all about women in the games industry. There's sort of this persistent myth that, the games industry has been a male-dominated field, and we really have to make this push to sort of get more women into games, and certainly, that is true. Except women have been in the games industry for ages, but the narrative surrounding it has basically erased a lot of them, and that is something that, again, is a thing that we should consider and we should try and sort of fix wherever we get the chance. I'm not going to ramble about this too much though, because I am a big white cis guy, and there are people that can say these things generally a lot better than me, but equally it's important that I try and say them as well. Games, as I said, can be used for good. And games, I think, inherently are good. They can be twisted for nefarious purposes, but there is a lot of good that can be done with them. Everything from education, so there are a number of research projects sort of at and around the university in particular that do things like this. Life Guide, if you've ever come across it, is a behavioral intervention sort of system. So it's a way of, calling it a game is a bit tricky, but it's a technologically assisted behavioral intervention system where the idea is, if you want to quit smoking, you get this app on your phone and it will prompt you at the right times where you're thinking about smoking, and it will try and stop you from doing that, as well as loads and loads of other things, but I'm not going to get too much into that. But the key difference with that is it's all about informed consent. That sort of very much highlights that we are trying to not only change your mind, but change your behavior. Games themselves can be used as a form of protest. If there is a thing that you don't like, you can absolutely make a game, raging against it, satirizing it. You can make a game for protest. So the company that made that McDonald's video game also had a set of print and play games. So if you are ever at a protest, you can sit there and play a game with your friends to pass the time as you are cattle. But also, games are a space for us to support each other and to recover from some of the horrible things that are out there in the world. So as much as I'm saying everything is political, you don't always have to critically evaluate everything you're playing. It is okay to just play a game for fun, but it's still worth bearing in mind that those things are there under the surface. So what do we do with all of that? So yeah, as I say, do all games have to be analysed through a political lens? Should everything we make rage against the machine? No. Sometimes we do just want to, curl up, play a comforting game, and sort of escape from all of those things. And that's fine. That's valuable in its own right. They can just be something to get us through tough times. But we still have the choice and the opportunity to make games that might go on to change people's minds. And if we're going to do that, or even if we're not setting out to do that, we should be wary of that, and we should think about the way that we are doing it. Cool, so I will wrap up there. Thank you very much for listening. Does anyone have any questions?